I'm Andrew Cunningham, and I'm an analyst with Moody's Investor Service, the international rating agency. I'm based in London, and for part of my career with Moody's I've been involved in analysing Middle East banks, and as part of that it was Islamic banks. And tomorrow I'm going to be giving a presentation at the conference looking at banking risk, and not just looking at balance sheet risk but long-term strategic risks which banks throughout the world are facing. And then, having identified a few key strategic risks for banks wherever they may be, I want to drop Islamic banks in there and say, okay, how are Islamic banks placed to face up to those risks? If you want to define risk, ask yourself the question, is the bank that I'm looking at now going to be here 5 years from now? Or is something going to come which is going to destroy its profitability? Is it going to be a shock to the system, for example, as we saw in Asia a few years ago? Or, and this is what I'm going to be looking at tomorrow, is the market going to move away from the banks? So they may be quite good at what they're doing, but they're not fulfilling the long-term needs of their customers, so people will just go to other providers. Islamic banking is a form of finance which is driven by total adherence to the Sharia. And that's an important concept, because these Islamic banks are not profit maximization vehicles. It may be that they make profits, it may be that they don't make profits, but providing that they are adhering to the tenets of the Sharia, they are Islamic banks. And that's the overriding important thing for an Islamic bank, to adhere to the Sharia. Typically, if you look at an Islamic bank, the thing that stands out immediately is that it will not pay interest and it will not receive interest. Now, there are other elements to Islamic banking, but that attitude to interest, which derives from the Quran and the sayings of the Prophet, is a defining feature. And from those, and from other elements of the Sunnah, a body of precepts has emerged as to how you should go about the banking business. A regular bank is out to make money for its shareholders, is out to make profits, and to some extent it will perform a community role. Now, with some banks that community role is greater than with others, but the underlying objective is to make money, because if the bank doesn't do that, it will go out of business. Now, there's an interesting contrast with Islamic banks, because the business model for an Islamic bank is to fulfill the conditions of the Sharia. That's its overriding objective. It's not profit maximization. If it maximizes profits, then that's an advantage. But if you maximize profits, but you don't stick to the tenets of the Sharia, you're not an Islamic bank. When someone first hears about Islamic banking, the typical first reaction is, how do you do that? How can you have a banking system which doesn't rely on interest? Because interest is fundamental to the way we do banking these days. And as you start to explore Islamic banking and you talk to people who are actually doing that, then you understand how it's possible. And as you get deeper into it, one of the longer lasting impressions which you get is the piety of the Islamic bankers, the sense that they are not just engaging in financial transactions, but that in addition they are fulfilling a religious duty, which is to provide financial vehicles for the Muslim community. It's a very interesting question, because if you talk to a Western economist or a Western banker, that person will probably say to you that because Islamic banks are restricted in what they can do, that is, they can't do all the things which a conventional bank can do, that is a disadvantage, and it forces Islamic banks to be less efficient. But if you talk to a Muslim Islamic banker, then that person will probably tell you that there is no conflict between an ethical way of doing business and an efficient way of doing business, because Allah will have thought of the problems, and the surest way to be an efficient bank is to follow the teachings of Allah, and the two are inseparable. It can coexist, yes. Islamic banking will never take over the world, but there will always be a role for it as long as there is a Muslim community and as long as Islamic banks are able to develop products which are attractive to that community. And we've seen over the last, say, 20, perhaps 30 years, a huge increase in Islamic banking, and that's partly been driven by an increase in religious feeling in the Muslim world, but it's also been driven by the increased ability of Islamic financial institutions to devise products, to build distribution networks such as branches, ATM machines, which are attractive to the community. So unquestionably there's a role for Islamic banking. It may be a niche role, but then again it may be a very big niche. It could work at a macro level, but I don't think there will be a demand for it to work at a macro level as long as the whole of the world is not a Muslim community. When you're going to have people who are quite happy to engage in banking transactions which are riba based. If you look at long-term strategic risks, which is essentially to ask the question, are banks going to be able to fulfill the future needs of their customers, then I see no reason why Islamic banks should not be able to succeed over the long term. There are a couple of issues where it may be more difficult for them. One is that of internet access, because we see the internet being an increasingly important banking tool, and in some areas of the Muslim world, access to the internet is being restricted. That's a problem for banks. The second area where it may be a little more difficult for Islamic banks is in the nature of their balance sheets. We're seeing conventional banks using more sophisticated asset classes, such as securitization, subordinated loans, structured instruments on their balance sheet. And what this enables them to do is to get more juice out of the limited amounts of capital. So they can do more business with less capital. That gives them an advantage. Now, those instruments have not yet been developed from an Islamic banking perspective, which is not to say that they can't be, but at the moment, as I understand it, those instruments haven't received all the approvals that they might have received from the Sharia boards. So at the moment, that's holding Islamic banks back. No reason, of course, why in future they can't develop those products in an Islamic way.